Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukraine, Russia, China show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and my guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Yeah, so I would like to remind that this show is also about Russia and China, although we concentrate constantly on Ukraine. However, you cannot separate looking at Ukraine without taking a look at what Russia and China are doing, especially with the recent visit of Putin to China and all the stuff that is following up. Especially, there is some information that Russia, together with North Korea, are preparing decisive surprise right before the U.S. election, sometimes in October, November.
Yes, I took note of that also. That somehow that there might be this this October surprise, as they call it, intended to, which they think might, according to the views of these analysts, tilt the election so that President Trump is elected, over the current incumbent President Biden. Now that may be that's a case of be careful what you wish for, because President Trump during his administration was not exactly a friend of either Russia or China, and did so, and it is whistling in the dark to think that somehow if you get President Trump in there as in his second term, that he is going to make things any easier for Russia and China. As a matter of fact, given his history, President Trump may well turn around and make things even more difficult for Russia and China.
Slap huge tariffs on Chinese electric cars and all the goods.
Yeah. And, President Biden has already done that. By the way, a good example of historical analogy where was when President Reagan was elected in 1980 over then President Carter. Now, President Reagan was touting the need to build up U.S. defenses in response to the ongoing Soviet buildup. But it was interesting that I would contend, some historians have contended that there were actually two Carters during the Carter administration. Carter 1 was the early portion of the Carter administration, where Carter was contending that the Soviet Union really wasn't that big of a threat. Then came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And then we saw Carter 2. Carter 2 had the grain embargo, initiated the grain embargo, boycotted the Olympics in Moscow, and somewhat more subtly, initiated the U.S. defense buildup, which I would have personal experience of. When I came on active duty in 1980, one of the last acts of the Carter administration was, one of the things was in the defense budget, the U.S. military, the armed forces, everybody in the U.S. armed forces got an 11.1% pay raise. That was huge, the largest pay raise in the post-war.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Huge pay raise. And for me as a lieutenant then, that was really huge. But then President Reagan came in, and all he had to do was step on the accelerator. He just did, okay, we're going to do this even more. Whoosh, and away we went. So, again, President Biden, he's sending arms to Ukraine and initiating tariffs and various other things against China. Both are things of which, a President Trump might well continue. And he might surprise everyone by stepping on the accelerator and doing more of both. And I would argue also that his attitude, he has actually been playing uh, the relations with NATO. His actions have actually encouraged the various NATO allies to realize that, hey, we may not be able to rely on the U.S. carrying the largest share of the load for Ukraine. We'd better, in our own self interest, start contributing to Ukraine and helping them stop Russia, because we may not have the full and unrestrained support of the U.S. We are not sure should Mr. Trump be elected president. So it's a very interesting set of calculations, and fortunately for Ukraine, they are all playing to Ukraine's favor. And also interesting to note is that, by the way, that big offensive Russian offensive near Kharkiv, yeah, that's stalled. Okay, it's stalled, and the Russians are exhausting themselves with higher casualty rates. The Ukrainians are continuing to destroy units of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, further reducing it. They're continuing to attack Russian supply lines, Russian logistics centers, oil refineries. They're continuing to hammer away at it with drones and everything else the Ukrainians can think of to throw at them. And these are having a steady, not dramatic, it's not dramatic, but it is cumulative. It is definitely doing damage. It has definitely reduced the Russian ability to maintain an offensive in eastern Ukraine. And so I continue to argue that the stage is being set for a decisive counterpunch by Ukrainian armed forces. Quite possibly during this, again, I'll argue counter to the majority of Western analysts, saying that the counterpunch is likely to come this summer. And it doesn't have to be across the entire front. It merely has to be in a decisive and strategically important point. And more and more analysts are recognizing that Crimea is the true center of gravity of this entire conflict. If the Ukrainians successfully isolate, cut off Crimea, and cut them off from supply, and prepare it for a commitment of Ukrainian strategic reserves, which they have, and acquire certain other weapons to, say, even attain at least local air superiority over Crimea, which is also attainable. You combine all of these factors at the right time in the right place, and the Ukrainian armed forces have a very realistic possibility of retaking the Crimea this summer. It would
Uh,
be Go
Jean,
ahead.
I would like to mention one really unique clip from Russian television that one
Yes.
of its top propaganda masters.
Uh-huh.
He was retiring, and he said he addressed people of Crimea, Russians in Crimea. And he said, I must admit that for the last years, I was lying to you about that Crimea is Russia and so on. No, it's not. It's a part of Ukraine. And I recommend you all going out from Crimea, because Crimea will be Ukrainian and very soon. I think they took
That's
it away.
fascinating.
That's fascinating, because that's actually true. So finally, he sort of admitted he's lying, number one, and number two, realistically looked at the situation.
And here's another interesting possibility: as the Russians in Crimea are allowed to evacuate Crimea or leave Crimea, that would provide a very welcome opportunity for Ukrainians who have temporarily left or evacuated Crimea at the beginning of the conflict. That would provide an irresistible magnet to draw Ukrainians back into Ukraine,
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
particularly in the Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another analysis of situation in Russia by a few well-known economists, that Russia will not survive if the war will continue economically more than 2 years. In 2 years, they will put all its resources, all its manpower, everything what they got on the line. And by losing us now 1,500 people a day, if not more, they will not be able to sustain this
And,
horrible war.
and the thing is, Sasha, every day that the Russians continue to take that much in the way of that many in the way of casualties, cumulative, it not only negatively affects their post-war demographic recovery, their population growth, and makes it what was an existing a not good situation to start with even worse, but it also endangers their ability to economically recover. And
There's no way.
never mind that they wouldn't even be able to think about seriously starting a renewed offensive against Ukraine, particularly if the Ukrainians succeed in driving them out, being absorbed into the European Union, joining NATO, and becoming in effect NATO's eastern bulwark against any future aggression from Russia.
Jonathan, you remember after the Second World War, there was a Marshall Plan for Germany,
Yes.
for many other countries in Europe, and when in 1991 Soviet Union ceased to exist, there was a lot of help to Russia from United States, Western Europe, and this time there will be no help whatsoever to Russia. So
No.
they will, once the war is over, they will have to. But I don't think that once the war will be over, especially after taking Crimea by Ukrainians, I think that Russia as a country as we know it will no longer exist. I think it will disintegrate into probably eight different territories, with each one with its own government, and I think that's what it should be anyway. Because how you can rule this colossal country from one place in Moscow, which is not geographically, if you look at the map, it's not even in the center of
Well, the
Russia.
one thing we need to be cautious about in this situation, and I'm sort of borrowing my argument from a Soviet Cold War argument that
Hmm.
the Soviets used to be fond of, describing with which they describe the so-called crisis of capitalism. You remember this argument?
Yes.
They were contending during the Cold War that as the Soviet Union and its socialist allies continued to gain victories in the world socialist movement, socialist revolution, that the United States would become increasingly desperate, and that at some crucial moment, the United States would lash out with its nuclear arsenal in a desperate attempt to reverse the situation. That's the so called crisis of capitalism. Now, let's flip that. In effect, I contend that the Soviet leadership was, in fact, mirror imaging. They were projecting what they would do should the situation become that desperate. So if Russia, the Russian Federation, which places an apparently such a high value on its nuclear weapons arsenal, if they lose the war and they in fact start breaking up the part of Russia that still controls the nuclear weapons arsenal, will become exceptionally dangerous. And it has to be, uh, in order to forestall or negate such a possibility. Remember that episode I encouraged you to watch? If you have a chance to haven't watched it yet, watch it. It brings out my point. Errand of Mercy, original Star Trek episode. But here, the necessity of being able to negate or neutralize the Russian nuclear missile arsenal is a very key point. And a global ballistic missile defense system, such as I have been advocating, established in conjunction with the United States NATO allies, that will be a crucial component of stabilizing a future world in which Russia is no longer a major power to be feared. China may well be feared, but if we establish the global ballistic missile defense system that I've described in my book, the Worldwide Strategic Defense Matrix, otherwise at the acronym WISDOM, WSDM, countering with it's good marketing, but anyway, what the idea is to be, if you are going to stabilize a future world in which you have several nuclear powers, the key is ballistic missile defense to neutralize the nuclear arsenals of potential adversaries, and that will become one of the largest priorities for the United States during the next administration, and beyond that. Not building more nuclear weapons, but building sophisticated ballistic missile defense systems to neutralize potential nuclear arsenals of other nations.
Jonathan, how you will deal with a situation when I think on May 16th, Russia has started a new satellite on the orbit with all other satellites, which threatening to destroy the GPS system.
Yeah.
How would you deal with that?
Yeah, this is This is interesting to watch because, again, in the Russian view of U.S. strategy, I predicted, and it's coming true now, that the Russians in the 21st century would continue to play to strength to their two major areas of advantage: nuclear weapons and their use of space. So now, when the Russians view our so-called U.S. Space Force, the Russians and the Chinese do not see a Space Force from their perspective. What they see when they look at the U.S. Space Force is a set of approximately 80 targets that need to be neutralized, exploited, or destroyed. So what the Russians are in effect playing as a form of information warfare. They're sending up a satellite that is following our satellites, but again, we don't know, we aren't necessarily certain as to whether or not that is a true ASAT. It is following the orbit of what an ASAT would logically do, but it may not be in fact a threat at all. And they're in effect shadow boxing.
Yeah, most likely.
They're
But
throwing. Go
what
ahead.
would you say about the China is surrounding the Taiwan with their armada of ships and trying to isolate Taiwan? Is it intimidation tactics what China is using?
That is a certain point because again, you have to look at China's ability to sustain a space fleet, a space fleet of the type that I'm advocating, because I would be advocating that the United States should be, as part of this global BMD system, as the central pillar, upgrading the U.S. Space Force with its own space fleet. And where would you buy this? Where would you get the space fleet? You buy it from SpaceX. Because if you take a look at Elon Musk's existing reusable spaceships, his Falcon 9, his Falcon Heavy, his Dragon Heavy, and his starships, you take a look at the specifications for those. He claims that he wants to create a fleet of these to go colonize Mars. Yeah, not. When you take a serious look at it, that's not quite nearly as logistically supportable, not in the near term. However, you take a look at those specifications, and the specifications of his ships would fit the requirements of a Space Force space fleet very well. And you could use those chemically powered starships to carry out all the necessary missions that a U.S. Space Force would have to perform, including ballistic missile defense. There are other missions that it could carry out as well, but that would go beyond the scope of our program.
Absolutely.
But in any case, the idea is that the United States and its NATO allies, with creative thinking and being able to look at things from a different perspective, have realistic options that are a realistic set of what I call asymmetric response, or as the Russians would call it, strategia asymmetricheskaya reagирования.
Absolutely.
That's so Mr. Putin gets the message loud and clear. Okay, he's strategy of asymmetric response. Боже мой.
Well, he's now reorganizing his generals, and he let some of them go. And I'm wondering how far they will go for Mr.
Oh, it's probably going to go farther than that. The panic has not quite yet fully set in.
Absolutely. So he thinks that his new minister, Mr. Belousov, would provide him with better news, although it remains to be seen what would be the better news and when he is going to provide them. I really don't see a lot of good news for Russians, at least at this juncture. And tell me, Jonathan, from what your knowledge, do Russians have a similar the vehicles, like the equivalent of Elon Musk's machinery to bring into space of some kinds, some new rockets or missiles, for instance?
There, from what I have been able to research, from my perspective, the Russians do not have the necessary resources to produce a space, what I call would call a space control fleet or a space control posture to actually control any more than the Nazis in World War II would. They did not have a naval capability that was able to challenge Great Britain. What they had were the components of what we would call a sea denial strategy, being able to disrupt and deny the use of the seas for Great Britain and the US. And that was their key to being able to achieve any kind of victory in World War II. However, so when you have the Russians in the current situation, they do not have the ability yet, and not for the foreseeable future, I predict, nor do the Chinese have the ability to control space, control, and which would include the ability to deny its use to the United States and its allies. They do, arguably, have at least a rudimentary capability to disrupt and
Yeah,
deny and slow down the ability of the U.S. and its allies. And by the way, the U.S. and its allies, the way they are taking due note of this, and even Elon Musk has taken due note of this, the Russians' attempts to disrupt the use of Starlink in the Ukrainian conflict. So it's not that we're unaware of this. So it's that we have to be concerned about safeguarding and strengthening our ability to use Earth orbital space in support of military operations, and in particular, the support of military operations in Ukraine. We are taking those measures obviously now, but there are other things that we can do in a future administration to safeguard and prevent the use of space denial efforts by Russia or China, or for that matter, even North Korea. By the way, interestingly enough, back as early as June 2000, in a magazine known as Launch Space Magazine, June 2000, they had an article entitled Armageddon in LEO, Armageddon in Low Earth Orbit, in which the authors described what would happen if a single nuclear weapon were detonated in low Earth orbit. And they projected that it would cause billions of dollars in damage to all of the orbiting satellites, and to most of it highly disrupt the space infrastructure. So you may have heard or read about recent observations by various military and civilian leaders about this same thing. It's not new. They've just rediscovered the threat. Yeah, it's been there all along. It has been there, and I've written about it also as well back in the 1990s about the potential for some, even a rogue state like North Korea. All it would take would a single nuclear weapon and getting it into low Earth orbit, and they could have the potential to play Samson in the temple and bring the global space
yeah.
infrastructure crashing down on us all. And so there is always that threat that some insane actor or some really desperate actor might lash out with some sort of thing, which is why it's also is a future strategic imperative to create that global ballistic missile defense system. That under these types of situations, there is absolutely nothing to be gained by building more nuclear weapons. It does not affect the equation. What does affect the equation decisively is if you take those additional resources that you were going to channel into building more and better nuclear weapons, and you instead channel them into providing more and more ballistic missile defenses and establishing a decisive means to neutralize them for good.
Actually, Jonathan, when you are referring to possibility of Russians or Chinese using the nuclear weapon sometimes at the beginning of the century, it was a highly hypothetical proposal at the time,
Yes.
because neither of them would even think about something like this. Well, today Russia is emboldened by a undecisive posture of West and United States in war with Ukraine. And although I started to sense that something has changed because like before, somebody like Macron would make several calls to Putin to discuss some peace possibilities. And so it's no longer the case. Nobody calls Mr. Putin, from what I understand, anymore. So therefore, perhaps West is getting closer and closer to a situation when they started to understand and appreciate the fact that Putin must be stopped now and once and for all. And it's not a question whether Ukraine will not lose the war and Russia will not win the war. No, it's a completely change of attitude.
I would argue, Sasha, that the Western NATO members collectively are, separately or together, they are learning the lesson that Great Britain and France did not learn prior to the invasion of France in World War II. During that period, 1939 to 1940, between the invasion of Poland by Germany and the subsequent invasion by Nazi Germany of France in May of 1940, that period that was known as the Phony War.
Yeah.
There was that window of a false peace in which they thought that somehow maybe negotiations could still be made. But this was that lost window of opportunity that, had Great Britain and France taken advantage of it and launched an offensive against Germany with whatever means they had available. Yes, it would have been a very interesting, a nasty war, but it would have been a lot shorter than the actual World War II in Europe that ensued. And because I suspect that many Western militaries have now heeded that lesson and they're communicating this to their political leadership, they are coming to the realization, as if unless we want a repeat of World War II in Western Europe, we have to stop Russia now.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Jonathan. Listen, I think we've covered a lot of grounds today. Thank you very much for today's program. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Tuesday, same place, same time.
Thank
Glory
you.
to Ukraine. Bye bye, everybody.